Today is Sunday. I'm not going to talk about news of the day. I want to talk about the future, and try and war game a little bit, literally, what the future of Ukraine is going to look like. Now, currently, there are two main theories for how this war is going and how, and then ultimately, how it will end. It's essentially a Russia's doing really good theory versus a Russia's doing really bad theory. The Russia doing really bad theory states, well, you see, there's a lot of pictures of Russian trucks, individual trucks with flat tires. There are tanks that have run out of fuel. This convoy north of Kiev that's 40 miles long is just sitting there, and if they've been, running the trucks at idle to use them for heat, then they're all out of fuel. And those of you who know anything about diesel engines, modern, all electronic with very complicated stuff with lots of chips, you don't have to do this, but older diesel engines, which are used in military equipment because they're more robust and more reliable, if you run them out of fuel, it essentially takes a mechanic to get them going again. You have to prime the entire fuel system. And so when you run a vehicle out of fuel that runs on diesel, in these cases, you pretty much just abandon it. Unless you have a lot of time on your hands to get it going again. And so this side of the argument is saying, okay, the Russian convoy north of Kiev, it's dead. Russians all around the country are running out of fuel. They don't have any food. They're being given expired MREs, and they're all just going to collapse. And then at one point, when they're out of food, out of ammo, out of fuel, they're all just going to surrender. And the theory as to why this is that Putin is a dictator, and dictators don't care about logistics because they're dumb. They just care about big, shiny weapons that they can parade around with in Red Square. So Putin has bought lots of big artillery pieces and spent nothing on fuel trucks. Confirmation of this, they assert, is that there have been reports and photos of civilian box trucks being shipped by train towards the Ukrainian border, implying that they're going to try and use civilian trucks to transport equipment to the front lines in Ukraine. Of course, civilian trucks are two-wheel drive versus these big military trucks which have giant, very floaty tires, and they're six-wheel drive. Typically a tandem axle and a front axle, all with power to all six wheels, which of course, can hold their own in muddy terrain. These civilian trucks, of course, don't even have mud tires, let alone four-wheel drive, and they will have to stay to hard roads and dry dirt roads. Now, the other theory as to what's going on, and of course what will ultimately happen, is that the Russians have completed an encirclement, a so-called cauldron, of Ukrainian forces in the east. They are not focusing on Kiev because they want the Kiev government to remain intact so that they can negotiate a surrender to give more legitimacy to their new order. They don't want to just go in and smash the Kiev government in the way the United States smashed Saddam Hussein's government and then install a puppet regime. They want there to be a smoother transition where Zelensky essentially, signs a piece of paper and, rides off into the sunset, and then, a friendly new face comes in to replace him, who is just friendlier with Russia, and, all is well. That is the counter theory as to why the Russians have not taken Kiev and why they haven't really, moved on it, why the convoy is sitting there and all this. Now, also, you have this other side of the argument asserting what I was telling you earlier about the cauldron in the east. I've seen some, certainly I've seen some confirmation that the most intense fighting is occurring in the east. I've heard word from individual soldiers saying, we're effed over here, and we're surrounded. But what I'm starting to see a divergence in is the maps that are being circulated by the two sides. If you look at Wikipedia, for example, the map on Wikipedia of the war, of where the front lines stand, hasn't moved really in the last few days. It shows the encirclement of Mariupol, but there is no cauldron in the east to trap all of the guys who are fighting in Donbass and Luhansk, or Donetsk and Luhansk or Donbass. Whereas on maps being circulated by people who claim Russia is winning, show that the Russian troops have moved and closed a cauldron behind those 60,000 troops, so that you've got the Donbass troops, native militias on one side, and then the regular Russian army behind the Ukrainian guys that they're fighting, so that they've got a pincer and can attack them from both ends now. And as long as these troops are surrounded, they cannot return to Kiev to reinforce the capital, so the Kiev government is in much greater danger. Now, I tend to believe this second theory more, because I have not heard the Russia is on the brink of collapse crowd really addressing what's going on in the East. They have not addressed the concept of the cauldrons. Because they just keep saying, well, if Russia's doing so well, why haven't they captured any cities? Well, the cauldron theory, the cauldron strategy would explain why they're not doing that. And so I'm not saying that that's absolutely, true because of that. There could be an alternative explanation. I just haven't heard one. There's not been one put forward by the Russia is collapsing crowd, other than Russia has flat tires and they bought cheap Chinese tires rather than good Michelin tires. If you think I'm joking, yes, that is actually part of the argument, is that Russia bought cheap tires, cheap economy tires, trailer tires, essentially, instead of, good name brand tires. Now, the videos of the civilian trucks being moved towards the border, if they are in fact going to the military, not just going to a truck dealership, which, car dealerships also use trains to transport their inventory. So it's not out of the question that that train that we saw is just going to a dealership that could be anywhere, near the Ukrainian border. But if that were a sign that the Russian military actually did need those trucks, then, yeah, that would be a negative sign. But still, I have not heard any of the Russia's collapsing crowd give any reason and say, hey, Russia's actually not doing well in the East. They haven't said that. They keep talking about Kiev and Kharkov, but they're not talking about Donbass, where we are told they've encircled 60,000 troops. And of course, Mariupol, I don't know exactly how many troops are there, but it's a lot, and it's the Azov guys who are, the most savage fighters. So that would be a big loss to lose all those guys. Because, the hardened troops are going to be more effective in combat than, the conscripts who, frankly, don't really want to be there. Again, kind of think of the Azov Battalion as the Waffen-SS to Kiev's Wehrmacht. Now, at the end of the day, I don't want to name-call any of these folks who are making either the case for either side. I don't think that, I don't want to impugn their motives. I think that I've seen people make both those cases, and they seem to be in good faith, and they make legitimate arguments. But since I do at this time still believe that the Russians are winning and will win, I think that is the most plausible conclusion to this. What will happen once they have? Because remember, the Iraq War in many ways is still ongoing. The Iraq War that America started in 2003. But the initial invasion, the fall of Baghdad, the fall of Saddam Hussein's government, only took 3 weeks. The real war started after the fall of the government. And so what will become of this war once the Kiev government does fall, once the Russians do have control over whatever it is that they want to have control over? I think the consensus is that Russia does not want control of the whole country, because, frankly, even before this invasion, they would have regarded the West as being, far too difficult to hold, far too unwieldy, far too Nazified. And considering that their support in the East, even, has not been universal, there is still, you can see. It might be a majority of people who are either indifferent or supportive of the Russians, but there is at least a significant minority of people in the East who don't like them and don't want them around. They might not be a majority, and they might not be in every town, but they do exist. And I think that the Russians will have enough to worry about just trying to keep, those people from starting an insurgency. I don't think that they could even begin to try and tame the west of Ukraine. And of course, as I and so many other people pointed out, in Putin's speech, he did refer to that part of the country as being essentially being stolen from Poland by Joseph Stalin. Now, with that said, a division of the country under Russian control, that seems to be the most likely outcome. The east of Ukraine will be the remainder, the main state, essentially pre-World War II Ukraine. That's what we're going to see. And then the part of Ukraine that was added after World War II, the old Kingdom of Galicia, with its capital in Lemberg, as it was known then, or Lviv, as it's known now, or Lvov, or Lviv, or whatever the heck the Ukrainians want to call it. That will be the new seat of the Kiev government. Remember, the Americans have been preparing for this since before the war even started. And I thought this was a big mistake of the Americans. It's why one of the reasons, I should do a whole video on this. I said before this invasion ever occurred, gee, I don't think there's going to be an invasion, but it sure seems like the Americans want one. And I still stand by that. I think they wanted this war. I think they're salivating over it. They love it. They're ready to fight to the last Ukrainian. Not to the last American, of course. And, frankly, that's better than them wanting to fight to the last American. I don't want any Americans to die in this, but I don't want any Ukrainians to die in it either. But we got a report in the Washington Post today that the American government is preparing for a Ukrainian government in exile and a long insurgency. This is unsurprising. The Americans moved their embassy to Lviv from Kiev before the war ever started. They encouraged Zelensky to evacuate, to essentially, just, hey, let everything go. He has, reportedly refused. It does seem like he's been geolocated consistently in Kiev. I have no reason to believe that he is outside of Kiev. I did see some very pro-Russia accounts saying that he has fled to Poland. I've seen no evidence of that. I don't know why he would flee to Poland and not Lviv, since that is clearly going to be the new center of power. And as Alexander Mercurius pointed out, the Galicia would make an excellent host for these, let's say, irredeemable forces, these people who cannot be tamed by the Russians in the East. It would be a good pressure release valve for the Russians to send them. It also would give a place for people in the East who are dissatisfied with the new Russian administration or pro-Russian administration. It would give somewhere for them to go to where they would, of course, be welcomed and would, and would have visa-free travel because they'd already be considered citizens, allowing the Russians to consolidate their influence and power in the east and central parts of the country. So therefore, Galicia would be a rump state of Ukraine. It would call itself Ukraine. It would claim to be the rightful government of the whole country. It would be considered a capital or a government in exile. It would be kind of like Israel after 1948, where Israel claimed the whole of British Cisjordanian Palestine, and it would claim Jerusalem as its capital, but it in fact did not at that point control Jerusalem. Its capital was in Tel Aviv, and it only controlled, a certain percentage of the territory of the country. But it claimed to be the government of the whole territory. The government in the west, in Lviv, would be similar. It would claim, Kiev is the eternal, unchanging capital of Ukraine, and it's just currently in rebellion, and so we're in Lviv, but our capital is in Kiev. Then you would have an East Ukraine, maybe the Russians could call it the Ukrainian Democratic Republic, in the tradition of another state which the Russians divided between East and West. its capital would actually be in Kiev, in the old capital of the once United State, much like that other state which the Russians had a hand in dividing in half between East and West. The eastern half kept the old capital, or at least half of the old capital. In this new eastern state, the West, meaning the U.S., the CIA, could fund an insurgency, which they seemed to already be planning to do, just like they funded the insurgency in Syria. In time, with the help of the Russians, Assad's government in Syria was able to mop up that insurgency. It seems to be largely dealt with at this point. But remember, the Syrian civil war began, what, 10 years ago? No, over 10 years ago. It was 2011. And from what I understand, I don't know if the U.S. stopped funding all of the insurgency in Syria, but the funding of ISIS ended at the start of the Trump administration, about, what was that, 6 years ago now? And so without some force in America intervening to stop the intelligence community from arming, training, and equipping, assisting the armed insurgency in Syria, I think that would probably still be ongoing, or at least it would be much more violent than it is right now. And so, considering that there's going to be a significant minority in the east of the country who does not like Russia, wants the old Maidan regime back in power, controlling the whole of the country, there should be enough people because remember, the folks who are more wishy-washy, who would definitely want to live under the Maidan government but don't want to fight, they can just go to West Ukraine. That option will be open. It'll be left open by the Russians. There will be somewhere to escape to. But those who are left behind are going to be the ones who are the most dedicated. The people who oppose Russia and don't want to leave are going to be the ones most likely to engage in an insurgency which will be armed and enabled by the United States and other Western countries. Now, I hope I'm wrong about this. I would like for this to end, whichever side wins. I just want people to stop killing each other. That's just how I feel. You can call me a fence sitter if you want, but I don't hate either side here. And I also don't love either side here. I think that, both the Maidan government and the Putin government neither of them are governments that I would want to live under. Neither of them are governments I would fight to support. Neither of them are governments I would vote for. But the situation has been untenable for a long time, and I'm hoping that we will reach some kind of an equilibrium. At the very least, a divided Ukraine is going to be more stable than a united Ukraine. It will relieve a lot of the tensions because the people in the West who are, anti-West and pro-Russia are going to be an extreme minority, which in the united Ukraine, they are a substantial minority. In the West, if you lob off Galicia, they will be an extreme minority, and they will have the opportunity to flee to the east, which will be under Russian influence. And additionally, the people in the east who support the West and hate Russia will have the opportunity to flee west. And so you won't have a situation where a huge number of people are unwillingly being subjugated by one side or the other. It's a choose-your-own-adventure story for the future of Ukraine. Now, again, I don't think that people should have to, because Ukraine's a big country. I don't think people should have to flee, massive distances away from their home and leave their hometown, because of something like this. But I'm saying at least that's an option. And so therefore, these two states individually will be more stable than either of them were, or than the united country was leading up into this war. Especially if the Russians are wise and don't mistreat the Ukrainian speakers in the east the way that the Maidan regime mistreated the Russian speakers before them. If the new government, guarantees equal rights for all citizens and guarantees, hey, you're allowed to speak whatever language you want, you can teach your kids, you can speak whatever you want in your schools, we're not going to wage a culture war against you, which who knows, Putin does seem to be a bit of a culture warrior, so maybe he will wage a culture war against Ukrainians in Ukraine. But I can hope not, because it's not in his best interest to do so. Otto von Bismarck worked very hard to try and cobble together a giant German empire, and he went out of his way to bring Catholic German states into that empire, and then he proceeded to go on an anti-Catholic culture war. That's actually where we get the term culture wars from Otto von Bismarck. He was the original culture war. It was called the Kulturkampf in German. And the lesson that I got out of the Kulturkampf in history class is that it backfired on Bismarck. That it was not smart of him to try and bring this minority into, they were a majority when they were an independent state, mainly Bavaria, but there were other, in the south of Germany, there's a lot of Catholics, so it wasn't just Bavaria, but mainly Bavaria. And when he brought Bavaria into the German Empire, he then went about persecuting them. That's just not smart when you're trying to cobble together a larger state. And I'm not saying that all of eastern Ukraine will be incorporated into Russia proper, but it'll be incorporated into the Russian sphere of influence. So it'll probably be something like Belarus. If Lukashenko in Belarus, at the behest of Putin, started persecuting people who assert a unique Belarusian identity, I think that would be unwise and not in either of their best interests. So I would tend to think that there would be, at the very least, more equal rights, more ethnic harmony, or linguistic harmony, however you want to think about it, in this Russian-influenced post-war Ukraine than there was in the old Maidan Ukraine. Because before Maidan, it was understood and it was accepted that there were people in Ukraine who liked Russia, who identified with Russia, who, spoke the Russian language at home and in public. There were many parts of Ukraine where people just didn't speak Ukrainian at all. And after Maidan, their political parties were banned. They were banned from speaking Russian. They were banned, and I believe Zelensky himself said, since he's been in office, hey, if you feel like you're a Russian, you're in the wrong country. Get out. That's not a good. That's not a good way of bringing about harmony in your population. When you know that I think it's like 17% of Ukraine outright identifies themselves as Russians rather than Ukrainians, and then an even greater percentage of them, of course, speak Russian as a first language and are culturally inclined towards Russia. Because remember, it's not just a simple, okay, are you Russian or Ukrainian? There's a spectrum. There are Ukrainians who have more in common with Russians than they do with the West Ukrainians. Religion comes into this. It's Orthodox versus Catholic. I don't think there's a lot of Protestants in Ukraine. But I believe in the West, the church is, it's called like the Uniate Rite, where these are former Orthodox parishes that ascended or formed some kind of relationship with the Vatican. And then, of course, atheism, which is very strong, from what I understand, stronger in Ukraine than in Russia. Russia has been rapidly re-Christianized after the end of the Cold War. Ukraine, from what I understand, less so. But even without a belief in God, it's kind of like people who are even of Jewish descent, even if they didn't grow up practicing religion, or people who grew up practicing the Catholic religion or whatever. It is a cultural thing. People, people in a sense are always Jewish or always Catholic, even if they no longer believe in God or didn't believe in God to begin with. And so I get the feeling there's something similar when it comes to the Orthodox people. At least that's the impression that I get from Easterners. They talk about this like this is something very important, and so when people from that part of the world act like something is important to them, I tend to believe them, because they would know better than I do. So all that is to say that the kinds of people who would be inclined towards waging an insurgency in this new country are going to be culturally isolated. At least that's the impression I get. I don't feel like the people who they're going to be recruiting into either neo-Nazi militias or just, straight up, hey, anti-Russia, we want the Western government back in power. I don't feel like the kind of people who they're going to be recruiting into that are going to be Orthodox Ukrainians, people who speak Russian, who identify as Ukrainians but speak the Russian language, and that seems to be, where Russia is going to take over central and eastern Ukraine. That seems to be the dominant cultural paradigm. And so essentially, what I'm saying is that the Russians need to keep the zeitgeist on their side. So this has already run longer than I wanted. I wanted to keep it at like 20 minutes, but I just wanted to think out loud about where all this is going, where I see it, and how it's going to play out in the future. So with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.